Back in 2018, I raved about the Buchardt Audio S400s, and it was for a good reason. It's a bookshelf speaker that actually delivered on the promise of offering up big, high-quality sound from a small box. Now this year, they replaced it with a refreshed version, which they claim is better than the original in every single way. Now, is that true? Well, I have to admit, these speakers are pretty freaking good. So let's go ahead and talk about them. Alright guys, so here it is on the right hand side, the new Mark II version of the S400. And sitting next to it, the original. Now I admit that on camera, these speakers look practically the same. And there's a good reason for that. The Mark II is an evolution of the S400 platform, meaning that it has the same general design goal of giving you big, high-quality sound from a small box. And unsurprisingly, they went with the same design for this speaker, that being a compact two-way monitor with an 8-inch passive radiator in the back, a 6-inch woofer up front, as well as a 19mm soft dome tweeter that's housed inside of its own aluminum waveguide, or short horn if you prefer. Obviously, there's some similarities between these speakers, but there are also a number of differences between the outgoing model and the new model. So let's go over all of that right now, starting with the similarities first. So you will notice with the Mark II, you'll get the same 8-inch passive radiator that you do with the original, and you will also get the same high-frequency driver configuration. The only difference here being that the new model has this rougher coating around the waveguide. The new Mark II also comes with the same base finish options, being matte black and matte white. And another similarity is going to be the price. So this was really big. According to Buchardt, they wanted to make sure that the new Mark II wouldn't be much more expensive than the outgoing model. And I think they hit their goal here because if I remember correctly, the outgoing S400 retailed for just over $2,000 a pair at the end of its life, whereas the new Mark II retails for $2,100 a pair. Not too bad. So now it's time to talk about the differences. And the first difference is going to be the woofer that they use. They went with a paper cone driver in place of the aluminum driver. And there's two main reasons for that. Number one, the aluminum driver has some mechanical breakup at its upper frequency limits. And then number two, they just straight up like the sound of the paper driver better. And then there were a number of changes made to the cabinet. The first and most subtle is that the cabinet features a slightly more dramatic tilt along the front baffle. I'm assuming this is to help with time alignment. The next big thing, though, is that it is a larger speaker. And to show you what I mean, I actually have them on the floor. So to the right, we have the Mark II, and then to the left, we have the original. And it's not a huge difference, but it is notable. And this extra cabinet volume helps the speaker to give you a more natural bass response. Also, the cabinet is now braced, and in real life, you'll notice that the new version has a slightly whiter finish than the white with the original. Really difficult to describe, but in person, you can see it. And then what is maybe the biggest change is with the crossover. So what you're looking at right now is the crossover of the original S400. And it's not bad for something in its price range. In fact, one could argue it's pretty good. However, Buchardt Audio hired a new engineer for the Mark II, and he redesigned a crossover from the ground up. It's not even close to the same. And then he added more expensive parts, which I'm sure Buchardt Audio was not too happy about. Now, I didn't take the crossover out of the S400 Mark II because it's kind of a pain in the butt. So what I'll do is I'll flash an image for you guys so you can look at that and compare it to this guy right here. Okay. So that is essentially going to be it. The only other thing worth mentioning here is that the new Mark II is built in Indonesia and not China. So with all of that said, now it is time to talk about what the new Mark II brings to the table in terms of performance. Let's go. Okay, so I'm going to start off this evaluation by giving you all a short performance summary first. Now this section goes out to those of you who aren't too familiar with the S400 and you just want a general overview as to what these speakers bring to the table. So in short, what you're getting is something that's all about delivering on two virtues. The first being big sound from a small box, and the second being really good jack-of-all-trades performance. Now let me explain what I mean with the last bit. First, if you're like me and you listen to a wide variety of music, then you know how difficult it is to find a small speaker that can truly sound good with all genres of music, especially in a traditional two-channel stereo system. Well, with the S400 Mark II, it's something you don't really need to worry about because it truly can sound good with every form of music you can think of. Classical, jazz, rock, metal, classic rock, electronic music, rap. I mean, you name it, it sounds good with it. And then the second thing you'll notice is that when you sit down and you listen to the S400 Mark II, it's as if Buchardt Audio was looking to balance the virtues that audiophiles covet in a way that doesn't go too extreme to either direction. For example, when it comes to the character of the S400 Mark II, you'll notice that yes, it does have a warm presentation, but when it comes to how it projects sound out into the room, it's not laid back, nor is it forward and in your face like a Klipsch. Instead, it's somewhere in between. It projects in just a forward enough way to be interesting, but it's not offensive about it. When it comes to the treble is smooth, highly resolving in a way that easily allows you to hear the differences between the quality of the recordings that you're listening to or the equipment that you're using, but it's not so over the top that you feel like you can't listen to everything in your music collection without having a good time. Again, all about balance. And then when it comes to the mid-range, well, this is where the big sound from a small speaker really comes from, because the mid-range on the S400 Mark II is large. Yes, it does take on a slightly warm character, but again, it's all about that balance. It doesn't sound too thick, doesn't sound too thin, and if anything, it's all about transparency and giving you that nice tonal balance. And then when it comes to bass, it's the same story. A little bit of a warm character, but is all about balancing speed and heft. Now, this speaker can sound very muscular, but only when the recording calls for it. When it comes to dynamic output's really good for a speaker this size, and the imaging is fantastic. In fact, the layering within the soundstage is as good as many truly high-end monitors. So when you add all of this together, yeah, I think Buchardt Audio has one of, if not the best, jack-of-all-trades solution that I know of from a compact monitor in this price class. Now, I'm not saying there isn't better out there. What I'm saying is, if there is, I haven't come across it yet. Now, does that mean that this speaker is going to be for everybody? Well, no, of course not. Not everybody's going to like its sound. Some people are going to prefer a sharper or more forward or a more laid back presentation. There are people who like to listen at volumes of 95 dB or higher like they're at a rock concert. If that's you, the speaker's not going to be for you, because while it does sound powerful for its size, it's still small at the end of the day. And that leads me to people who expect visceral bass because they're looking at the spec sheet and they're seeing 33 hertz and they're expecting real visceral 33 hertz content. You're not going to get that. It's still a small speaker. And plus, quite frankly, it doesn't sound very good in a desktop environment. So clearly it's not going to be for everybody, but I think when you look at what you're getting for the money, it's a pretty good speaker. So that is going to be my short summary. So now let's go to the section that I'm sure most of you are here for, which is how it compares to the original S400. Let's go. Okay, so now it's time to go over what the Mark II brings to the table in terms of performance and how it compares to the original outgoing S400. And of course, the big question here is Buchardt right? Is the Mark II better in every single way when compared to the original? And for the most part, I would say yes, but let's get there in a moment, because really we need to remind ourselves as to what made the S400 so special to begin with, which is a small speaker that offers big, muscular sound. I mean, I'm all about that life, but we can't sit here and pretend like it was perfect either, because sometimes the bass could be a little bit thick sounding. Sometimes the treble could be a bit unrefined, and as we all know, it's not the best choice for people who like to listen at very low volumes. So when you check out the new Mark II, you'll notice that it's like Buchardt Audio went down this checklist of all the major complaints that people had about the original. They addressed those complaints while at the same time adding just a little bit of spice to the sound. And where you're going to notice that the most is the character of the Mark II, or how it projects sound out into the room. And this is when things get interesting, because when you listen to the old and the new side by side, they're unmistakably S400s. They both have a warm sound and they both have that classic Buchardt Audio signature. And yet, they're still different. The original has more of that obvious muscular sound, and if anything, is laid back in nature, whereas the new Mark II is cleaner. It's more balanced. It projects in more of a forward way, and it has more of a refined sound to it. And this actually has a number of different benefits. Number one, the Mark II sounds better at low listening volumes. It also sounds better at higher listening volumes. Now, no, this still isn't a speaker that's meant to recreate the sound of a rock concert, but it'll sound more comfortable at those higher volumes. And then, because it has more of a balanced presentation, it lends itself well to a huge variety of component types, whereas the original S400 is a bit more picky with what it's going to sound good with. Now, moving on, let's talk about the treble. And in this regard, yeah, it's pretty much better in every way. It's more resolving, more refined, yet at the same time smoother and easier on your ears regardless of the type of recording that you're listening to. And this is a really good balance that they struck. In fact, what trips me out is that both speakers use the same high frequency drivers, and this just goes to show you how big of a difference a crossover can make. Because the original speaker, let's face it, it wasn't the most transparent in the world, and at times it could sound pretty rough and gritty with recordings that weren't too great. Whereas the new speakers, they do a great job of showing you what your recordings really sound like, what your gear really sounds like, yet at the same time, when you listen to a recording that's not that great, it's still smoother and easier on your ears. I think the only problem with the Mark II is that depending on the positioning height, something that I'll get to later in this video, the treble may draw some attention to itself, or specifically the waveguide. It may become more localized, but that's something I'll get to later on. Next, let's talk about the mid-range. So once again, yeah, I think the Mark II is better in pretty much every way, and I think most people are going to agree with that. The mid-range doesn't have quite as thick of a character to it, but it still has that warm sound, and it's all about balance and transparency. It has this great sense of scale, the same pretty much as the original, only the big thing that you're going to notice is that not only is it a little bit more tonally accurate, but it projects in more of a forward way. And where you're going to notice this the most is with vocals. They take on this almost three-dimensional sound that the original just doesn't quite have, and I think most people are really going to appreciate that. And then next, let's talk about the bass. This is where I think opinions are going to be a little bit more polarized, because on one hand, the Mark II digs deeper. It offers up cleaner bass. It still has a warm signature to it. It doesn't sound dry or anemic by any means. But the thing with the Mark II is that the only time it's going to show you a lot of bass output is if the recording actually calls for it. Whereas the original, that's what gives the original S400 its wow factor. Is you take it out of the box, you play a bass heavy track, and like, whoa, all that bass from a small speaker. Even though that's courtesy of an artificial hump that the Mark II doesn't have, it still has that wow effect, something that the Mark II doesn't have. However, when that recording calls for it, you will notice that the Mark II actually can output more bass than the original. It's just going to be cleaner in its delivery. And I think opinions are going to be somewhat mixed about that. When it comes to dynamic output, the Mark II is hands down better. It's a very dynamic speaker for its size. And then when it comes to imaging, once again, it's just better. And I think everyone's going to agree with that. There's more depth and layering to the soundstage, almost like a proper high-end speaker. And again, it sounds more three-dimensional in its delivery when compared to the original. So all in all, yeah, you know what? I think Buchardt Audio did a great job of taking what made the S400 so good and then addressing its weaknesses to give us a better sounding product. Now, is everybody going to prefer it over the original? Of course not. And of course, I can't tell you what you're going to prefer. That's what trial periods are for. But by and large, yeah, I think they did a great job with this speaker, and they did all of this without losing the fun, without what made the S400 so fun to listen to begin with. So anyways, that is enough praise for the Mark II. Now it is time to balance out this review by going over some caveats. So let's go. So here's the thing. When you look at the S400 Mark II for what it really is, which is a tiny speaker that's meant to deliver big, good all-around performance, then it's very difficult to criticize this speaker because it does such a good job of achieving its goal. And yet, it's not perfect, and there are some things that you may need to be aware of if you're considering something like this for yourself. Starting with bass. Now, I like the bass on the Mark II. I think it's great. However, I noticed that on their website, they claim that it digs all the way down to 33 Hz. And while I have no doubt that it can do so, it's a misleading specification, because that means some people are going to come to me and they're going to ask, hey, do I need a subwoofer with this speaker? And the answer is, if you're a bass head, if you listen to bass heavy music, or you care about those bottom octaves, the answer is yeah, you're still going to want a subwoofer or two. And here's why. If I were to take this little speaker and then sit it next to a big tower speaker with the same specifications, you will notice, unsurprisingly, that the big tower speaker is going to have fuller bass output. And the reason being is, despite what the specs may say, there is still no replacement for displacement, or in other words, big drivers, a big amount of radiating surface area, inside of a big cabinet. So you need to enter this with realistic expectations insofar as bass quantity is going to be concerned. Next, This is a speaker that requires a little bit of distance between your ears and the front baffle in order for the sound to come together. So if you're sitting about 5 feet or closer to the S400 Mark II, it may not sound that well integrated, meaning that this is more for people who sit about 6 feet or further away from the speaker. Now, this also means that it's not going to get my recommendation for somebody who's looking for a really good desktop solution. If that's you, there are better options out there like the LS35As, the KEF LS50 Meta, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, it's actually a very easy speaker to work with, and that leads me to setup tips and equipment matching. Let's go. Okay, so the good news is that the S400 Mark II is a pretty easy speaker to work with. In fact, the only real guideline that I have for you guys is that you want to be sitting at least 5 or 6 feet or more away from the front of the speaker, and that's to help the sound to come together in more of a balanced way. Meaning that, yeah, as I just mentioned, it's not a speaker for desktop use or for ultra near field listening. Beyond that, it's a pretty easy speaker to work with. Now, Buchardt Audio recommends that when you position them in your room to have your ears in between the position of the woofer and the waveguide. Now, I actually somewhat disagree with this recommendation. In my opinion, for the most balanced presentation, you actually want your ears closer to the position of the tweeter. This is what's going to give you the best balance between the treble, the mid-range, and the bass, and this will allow you to hear what I reported in this review, because when you get your ears in between the drivers, that's when the treble is going to call more attention to itself, and that's going to lend to a more polarizing listening experience among users. Next, let's talk about stand height. So if you want to get them higher, that means you will likely want to use 28-inch stands in most rooms, and you don't have to go crazy with the stands. Pangea, Monoprice, something halfway decent is going to work fine for these speakers. And then next, let's talk about positioning as far as how far apart they should be spread. In my experience, these speakers like to be spread far apart from one another, and when it comes to tone, I prefer the sound with the speakers pointed directly towards the middle of my shoulder area, so pretty aggressive tone. This is what's going to make the speakers sound very big for their size, give you a locked-in center image, and I think that's a sound that will impress most people, and it still retains really good balance between the treble, the mid-range, and the bass. The only other thing worth mentioning here is how far they need to be from a wall boundary. Now, because the new Mark IIs have cleaner bass than the original, you can actually get away with putting them fairly close to a wall while still enjoying high quality bass. So if you need to place them like 6 inches away from a wall boundary, you can get away with that. Now, for the best performance in the mini rooms, yeah, you'll probably want to pull them at least a foot to a foot and a half away from any wall boundary to get the best sound. But the important thing is it's not necessary for the Mark II. Anyway, that's going to be it for setup tips. So now let's go over equipment matching. So now I have some even better news for you. The S400 Mark II is refreshingly easy to work with when it comes to equipment matching, far better than the outgoing S400, and this is mostly due to its more balanced and transparent sound. Now, something that I forgot to mention earlier is that it's also a little bit easier to drive, meaning that you have a whole bunch of different amplifiers that you can use to get great sound out of the Mark II, and if anything, it's more about understanding what it is that you want out of the listening experience. That way you can find the right solution for these speakers. Now, when it comes to power requirements, as I just said, they're not too difficult to drive. So if you're in a smaller room and you listen at moderate volumes to low volumes, you can get away with as little as 15 watts per channel, provided that product uses a high quality power supply. However, for most people, you will want to use something that offers anywhere between 60 to 120 watts per channel to cover most listening habits. Now, before I wrap this up, I know there are a lot of people out there who want very specific recommendations of what works well, and in my experience, the S400 Mark II sounds great with the Unison Research Unico Primo, which here in the US costs just a little under $2,000, and it has a sound that just is so good with the Mark II. Value for days, highly recommended that you check it out if you're in the US at least. Anyway, that is going to be it for equipment matching, so now let's go ahead and wrap up this review. Well, surprising no one, this has ended up being a rave review. But come on, you expected that from me, right? I mean, I'm the guy who raved about the original S400. Because when you get right down to it, the Mark II still honors the tradition of offering up big, high-quality sound from a small box. Only the Mark II is better in most ways when compared to the original. Now, does that mean everybody is going to prefer the Mark II over the original? No. The original does have a slightly different sound and a character that some people will inherently prefer. And if you're stuck and wondering whether or not it's worth the upgrade, let me put it to you like this. If you have the S400 and you are completely happy with it, you love the sound, you love the speaker, don't do anything. Keep what you have, enjoy what you have. However, if you're somebody who maybe you tried the S400 and there were some things about it you didn't like and you feel like that was addressed in this review, by all means, try it out. Or maybe you own the S400s and you kind of like the sound, but you wish some things were better. And again, those things were addressed in this review. Yes, by all means, go ahead and try it out. And of course, if you're somebody who has no experience with them and you just want a really good all-around speaker that's small, yes, try it out. But still, it's not going to be for everybody. Now, I could end this on some kind of an emotional note and talk about how much I love listening to music through the S400 Mark IIs, but come on, obviously I did. So I'm going to end it by saying this. Buchardt Audio could have gone in a number of different directions with the refresh of the S400. And the easy way to go would have been to just leave the same exact recipe and to only make subtle changes here and there. But the decision to take the foundation of the S400 and then to liven up the sound a bit, to clean it up a bit, to remove the bass hump that quite frankly was the very thing that was so impressive about the original S400 to begin with, I think it's a daring move, but I think it's exactly what this speaker needed to remain competitive in 2021 and to stand out among really good peers in and around the $2,000 price point. Because what they ended up with is a speaker that is incredibly balanced, that finds the right mix between giving you enough of what most audiophiles want without going too extreme into any direction. And I think that's something worth celebrating. Anyways, that is going to be it from my take on the S400 Mark II. A freaking good speaker. If you're into comparisons, stick around for the bonus sections of this video. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. Okay, so this is the first of two bonus comparisons, and I thought it would be cool to kick things off by going over how the Buchardt stack up to a different yet popular speaker in the same general range, one that many of you may be cross-shopping. Now, I realize that some of you are going to say that, wait, this isn't fair. The LS50 Metas are much smaller than the Bucardts, and they also retail for less money at $1,600 a pair versus the $2,100 a pair for the Bucardts. And while that is absolutely true, I'm using this comparison to emphasize a point. And plus, I will briefly talk about how the R3s stack up to the S400s very soon. But first, I need to emphasize that there's a reason why I always say that there's no one solution that's going to make everybody happy, because the LS50 Meta has a completely different presentation that some of you may actually prefer. So let's go over the advantages of the KEF first, starting with the build quality of the cabinet. Let's just be straight up. It uses significantly better materials than what you find on the S400. Now, the trade-off to that is that the S400 uses a significantly better crossover than what you get on the LS50 Meta. So that's a pretty even trade. But now it's time to talk about utility. The LS50 Meta, let's just call it what it is. It doesn't output a whole lot of bass, but because it doesn't output a lot of low frequency information, that means you can place it directly against the wall and still get very clean bass output, something that you can't quite do with the S400 Mark II, because while it's more flexible than the original, you still need to give it at least a little bit of room to breathe in order to enjoy clean and articulate bass output. And then next, the KEF LS50 sounds very coherent when your ears are only a couple feet away from the drivers, something that definitely cannot be said for the Bucardts, meaning the LS50 Meta takes the easy W for ultra near field listening or desktop listening. And then of course there's going to be the big difference in terms of sound. KEF is all about giving you this sharp, clear, and well-defined sound, something that makes it super easy to pick out subtle details within the recording and something that gives those details their own sense of space. And while Buchardt is reasonably detailed and it has no problems with detail separation, it doesn't have the same sharpness and unforced clarity that KEF has. And that leads me to the KEF R3, which is essentially a bigger version of the LS50 Meta in a way. It has the same general sound, only the R3 is a bit brighter, a bit more beamy in the upper mid-range, a bit more energetic, And don't get me wrong, some people are still going to prefer that more clear and direct sound than what you get out of the Buchardt, which by comparison is going to be warmer, more muscular, and a bit more refined and smooth around the edges. So as always, it's a matter of determining what it is that you want. So with that out of the way, now it's time to go over the advantages of the Bucharts, and this is where it starts to become very one-sided, starting with the bass output, which is significantly stronger and deeper than both the Meta or the R3. It's not even close in this regard. And the same could be said for the mid-range, which is much more full and balanced than either the Meta or what you get with the R3. The treble is going to be smoother, more refined. The imaging is going to be deeper, just more three-dimensional. Dynamic output is going to be significantly better than the Meta and notably better than the R3. The R3 is actually pretty good in this regard too, but the Buchardt is going to be better. So if somebody's looking for a well-rounded solution for a two-channel stereo system, I think the Buchardt Audio is still the easier recommendation as it has a less polarizing sound than what KEF delivers. But still, you may still prefer the KEF because it has that sharper, brighter sound. So that is it for the first comparison. So now let's move on with the last comparison of this video. Okay, so I finally reached the last segment for this review, so forgive me as I just leave the camera on a tripod and I talk to you all from the side here. Now, this is a comparison that I want to make because I know there are plenty of people out there who are interested in how the KLH Model 5 stacks up to the new Buchardt Audio S400 Mark II. Because let's face it, both of these speakers are absolute beasts for the money. They deliver a great value and they have the kind of sound that can make people happy for many, many years. Still, they're very different speakers, and I know there's people out there who are cross-shopping the two who are wondering which one may be best for them. I'm going to do my best to address that question right now, and the game plan is to give you a short summary first, and then I'm going to dive into just a little bit more detail. So the short summary goes like this. The KLH Model 5 is a bigger speaker, and unsurprisingly, if you like that fuller range sound, if you listen at high volumes, if you want that more punchy bass, then you know what? The Model 5 is going to make you happier. This holds especially true if classic rock is a huge part of your listening diet. Now, on the flip side, if you want big sound from a small speaker, and if you like more of a refined and smooth sound with deep layering within the soundstage, then there's a good chance you will prefer the S400 Mark II, especially if classical music is a large part of your musical diet. So that's it for the short summary. Now let's dive into more detail, starting with the advantages of the Model 5. So look, as you can imagine, the larger Model 5 is going to give you more bass. It's going to play at louder volumes. And the treble, because it uses an aluminum dome tweeter, is going to have a bit more energy to it, more sharpness to it, which, by the way, you can't attenuate on the back of the speaker. And otherwise, the KLH Model 5s do a better job of laying down a rock-solid center image in a way that the S400 Mark IIs can't quite muster unless you really fuss around with placement. Otherwise, I mean, look, there's a reason why I raved about the Model 5. It is such a good musical speaker, one that, as you can tell, I haven't let go of yet. And that leads me to the advantages of the S400 Mark II. So what the Mark II lacks in just sheer quantity, it makes up for in quality because, let's face it, the S400 Mark II uses more expensive parts than what you find in the bigger speaker. And unsurprisingly, this translates to the listening experience. It's going to be more balanced, more refined, more revealing, more transparent. It's going to be smoother, more refined. The soundstage is going to be wider and deeper. The Mark II sounds like a proper high-end speaker. Don't get me wrong. While the Model 5 is a lot of fun, the Mark II, again, it just sounds like it comes from the high end, while still retaining a nice, fun, and engaging musical charm. The good news is that both speakers are pretty easy to work with. Now, when it comes to positioning, the KLH Model 5 is drop and plop. You have to do a little bit more with the S400 Mark II to get the best sound out of it, but it's not hard. When it comes to equipment matching, I think the S400 Mark II has a slight advantage here. It should sound better with a wider variety of equipment, whereas the KLH Model 5, it tends to need something with a muscular sound in order to really bring it to life. Otherwise, guys, some of you are going to say, well, which one's best? There is no best. They're both really good. It just depends on what you need. And if you're still stuck on which one you would prefer, then God help you, because God knows I can't even decide for myself, right? This is a really tough one. The only solace here is that no matter which way you fly, you're getting a great speaker for the money. Anyway, that is going to be it for this review, guys. As always, thanks for watching. Hopefully you got something valuable out of this. And until next time, peace.